Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Yorkville Housing Laboratory webinar. I'm Zeynep Turan, Manager of Preservation and Outreach at Friends, and we're so glad to have you join us. For those unfamiliar with Friends, we are a nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving the unique character and sense of community and place on the Upper East Side. Tonight, we're diving into a critical issue that shapes that character profoundly: affordable housing. Specifically, we'll be exploring the history and evolution of affordable and progressive housing solutions right in Yorkville. We believe that understanding and learning from the past is crucial to shaping a sustainable and equitable future for our community. I am delighted to introduce tonight's presenter, Lucie Levine. Lucie is the Preservation Advocacy and Community Outreach Manager at the Historic Districts Council. She is also the founder of the historical tour and event company, Archive on Parade. Lucie's work is impressive. Since 2017, she has offered tours and lectures on New York City history in collaboration with the New School, the American Institute of Architects, and the New York Public Library. And some of you may remember her marvelous She Built New York City walking tour last November for Friends, which highlighted the social and architectural history of women's institutions on the Upper East Side. Lucie has also shared her expertise widely, publishing insightful articles on New York City history in outlets like the Gotham Center for New York City History blog, JSTOR Daily, and 6 Square Feet, where she was the contributing history editor and writer. Just a quick note about the format for this evening. This is a webinar, so everyone will be muted to ensure no audio disruptions for the 40-minute presentation. However, we absolutely encourage you to ask questions. Please drop them in the chat box and we'll address them after Lucie's presentation. And one last reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website. And unfortunately, Lucie's camera isn't working tonight, but her voice will be guiding us. So now, without further ado, I'm pleased to turn it over to Lucie. Welcome, Lucie.
Thank you so much, Zeynep. Hi, everybody. I wish you could see my face. I'm sorry about that. I hope you can hear my voice. It is a pleasure to be here with you this evening to talk about progressive housing solutions in Yorkville. We're going to be talking about a number of experiments in affordable and middle-income housing that were built in Yorkville in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I feel really privileged to give this webinar because I actually learned a lot of this history when I was working with Friends during the pandemic as a public events coordinator, and I had the privilege and pleasure of doing some of this research at that time, and the urgency of this work and Friends advocacy around it has only grown. So it's been really wonderful to watch Friends dive even further into that work and to get to talk about it with you this evening. So first, what I want to do is define Yorkville. So I have heard a number of ways to do this. I've seen the southern border of Yorkville defined as 79th Street. I've seen it called 72nd Street. I've seen the western border called Lexington Avenue. I've heard it called 3rd Avenue. There are a lot of ways to talk about neighborhoods in New York City. But for the purposes of this talk, what I'm defining as Yorkville is what I have outlined here in purple. So that is from 72nd Street to 96th Street, from 3rd Avenue to the East River. So that's where we will be this evening. Now, incidentally, right now, Yorkville is the most densely populated neighborhood in the country, but of course, it wasn't always that way. This is Lenape-Ho-King. This is the unceded territory of the Lenape people. But in the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, it was actually home to gracious waterfront estates for established families in New York City like the Beekmans and the Schermerhorns. This is, to me, a really interesting property map. This is from the New York Public Library, and this shows property holdings between 72nd Street and 95th Street from Park Avenue to the East River, and this was a property holding map made in 1815. And so you can see that people owned very vast tracts of land, but there was almost no development in the area. So some of the people who owned mansions here are names that you will know, like the Beekmans, who gives their name to Beekman Place, the Schermerhorns. But the most famous of the estates in this area was, of course, Gracie Mansion, which was built, the original section of Gracie Mansion was built in 1799. But for the purposes of this discussion, the most important family in the area were the Rhinelanders. And this is a sketch of the Rhinelander property as seen in the middle of the 19th century. So the Rhinelanders were German-born French Huguenots. Huguenot just means Protestant. And so they were French Protestants, and they had amassed vast wealth in real estate, in shipping, and in sugar. And in the 19th century, they would build a number of experimental housing types in Yorkville, as well as a number of charitable buildings. But I'm going to stick on this theme of French Huguenots for just a moment, because actually French Huguenots played an outsized role in the physical form of the city of New York. And some of their names will be familiar to you, like Delancey and Bayard, right, who give their names to streets in Lower Manhattan and the Lower East Side. You are probably familiar with the plan of New Amsterdam, but you may not know that it was created by a French Huguenot surveyor by the name of Jacques Cortelyou. So I am going to tell you about one more French Huguenot, and the reason that there was such a sort of outsized population of French Huguenots in New Amsterdam is that there was France at that time in the 17th century was an almost entirely Catholic nation, and Protestants had a certain amount of rights, and then there was some tension, and those rights were repealed. And so on losing some of those rights in France, there was a sort of major exodus of Protestants from France in the 17th century, which is why there was like an outsized role of French Huguenots in New Amsterdam and what became New York. So the person, though, that I want to turn to is a man by the name of John Pintard. This is, most of the paintings or etchings of him show him as much older, but this is the one like rakish image of John Pintard that I love showing, because he is one of my favorite sort of unsung heroes of New York City. Now, he was of French Huguenot ancestry, and he actually translated the Book of Common Prayer from English into French, and that book in the French language is still in use, which I find to be really kind of moving. But he was a native New Yorker. He was born and died in New York City, but he came from that French Huguenot ancestry, and he was once referred to by the New York Times, I quote, as a Renaissance man who is most famous for popularizing Santa Claus. Yes, but in addition to advocating for St. Nicholas to be declared patron saint of New York City, John Pintard was a lot of things. He was really a civic powerhouse. He was a soldier of the Revolution. He was a good friend of George Washington. He was the founder of the New York Historical Society. He was the first secretary of Tammany Hall. He was treasurer of Sailor Snug Harbor on Staten Island. He helped found the New York City public school system. He was on the Erie Canal Board, and he wrote a report from New Orleans that directly influenced the Louisiana Purchase. But for our purposes, his most important role was that he was New York City's first health inspector. I mention this to you, focusing on both the Rhinelanders and John Pintard, because what I hope this talk is going to connect for you are a couple of factors that made these experiments in housing, and particularly affordable housing, possible. And those factors were incredible private wealth, public health, and civic purpose. So those three factors, immense wealth, a discourse around what public health would mean, who was the public, how you could ensure a healthy populace, and then the goals of civic pride and civic purpose come together to make Yorkville into a space where it's possible to have this really dramatic effort in housing reform. So, what's so amazing to me when I think about the Rhinelanders and I think of John Pintard is the way that these lives intersect and how we know that history is just so fascinating because everything in the entire world is connected. Are you ready for this? So, John Pintard's role during the American Revolution was a deputy commissary for prisoners. So it was his job to get prisoners the goods they needed and to try his best to relieve their suffering as much as was possible. Now, fascinatingly, the Rhinelander Sugar House on Livingston Street in Lower Manhattan, seen here in a very derelict condition at the end of the 19th century, was actually commandeered by the British during the American Revolution as a prison. And John Pintard was on the scene. So you have the Rhinelanders earning this enormous wealth in sugar and having this estate in what's now Yorkville. And you have John Pintard, who is down at the base of Lower Manhattan, like with the prisoners in the Sugar House prison. And you're just like, history is unreal. It is so cool. It is amazing. Okay. So there were in this building 600 prisoners. And I also want to be clear that the Rhinelanders, this was commandeered. It was not their goal to make this into a prison. They were not holding these people hostage. This was a situation where this building was commandeered by the British. This was not a Rhinelander goal. I want to be clear. But there were 600 prisoners in this building, and John Pintard wrote about their dying of jail fever and of smallpox, among other things. And what I'm trying to share when I tell you that is that even in the 18th century, in New York City, there was an understanding of the relationship between crowding, disease, and living conditions. People knew even during the American Revolution that if you have 600 people gathered together in squalid conditions, they will get sick and they will die, which is what happened. And this becomes very meaningful as the city emerges from the revolution and begins to grow both in population and through the development of the built environment. For example, no, before we get to the park, okay, for example, there was a letter to the New York Daily Advertiser in 1788 that castigated the city government for allowing new buildings to be built crowded together along the shores of New York Harbor. Such building led not only to crowding, but also to what the writer called wet cellars. The writer continued, wet cellars make damp houses, and damp houses sickly inhabitants. The letter went on to say, from the moment that you render ground so valuable as to narrow the streets and crowd houses upon houses, you poison the air and turn these healthful gales into infectious vapors. So this fear of bad air and infectious vapors is also part of why families like the Rhinelanders had country seats in what is now Yorkville, because Yorkville was remote from the city. If we think about the city as where this Sugar House prison was on William Street in Lower Manhattan, then Yorkville is absolutely the country. And so, in the face of epidemics like yellow fever in 1795 or cholera in 1832, people like the Rhinelanders and other wealthy families could be as far away as was basically possible at that time from densely populated lower Manhattan. So, Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed Central Park, explained how these families felt about this sort of fear of bad air, this fear of what was called dispensation. He said, foul air was, quote, often provocative in times of epidemics of a panicky disposition to flee the town. Now, as we know from, of course, COVID-19, many people wanted to flee the town, right? Um, that's not something that is sort of like remote to us today, or something that is only true or was only true in the 18th century. That's true even today. And so Frederick Law Olmsted went on to explain how parks came to be understood as they are now as the lungs of the city. He wrote, "Where there are parks, they give the highest assurance of safety, as well as a grateful sense of particularly fresh and pure air." So parks are one way that public health gets built into the cityscape. Another is the Commissioner's Grid of 1811 that gives New York City its grid. This was a plan um, to lay out the grid that we have today. The plan was to lay out the grid from 14th Street to 155th Street. And in 1811, when this plan was conceived, most New Yorkers still lived south of Canal Street. So this was a really forward thinking way of understanding what it would mean to build the city. And part of that goal in building the city was public health. So the stated goal of the commissioners who created this grid was, quote, laying out streets in such a manner as to unite regularity and order with the public convenience and benefit, and in particular to promote the health of the city. So the idea of order, of defined public space, was a way of thinking about how people could be safe and well in the city. And as the city grows, more and more of these sort of modernizing conveniences are going to be part of this effort toward public health. One of them is the Croton Aqueduct. This is a photo of the Croton Aqueduct at High Bridge. This is in 1859. The High Bridge is the city's oldest bridge. The Croton Aqueduct was a remarkable feat of engineering. It opened in 1842 and it brought clean water to the city of New York. Um, and it was a revolution in public health and public safety, but there was always a question, as there is now, of who constitutes the public and who are these reforms really for? Who gets to be part of the public? Who is a citizen of the city? And it was a kind of interesting study in contrasts because the excitement around the Croton Aqueduct was the most intense excitement that the city had ever seen. The opening of the aqueduct saw Croton water flowing from the fountain in City Hall Park and occasioned the largest parade in the city's history up to that time. Now, interestingly, much of the pipe system that brought Croton water to New York City was constructed by Irish immigrant laborers who, it could easily be argued, needed clean water the most in the 1840s when the aqueduct opened, but were least likely to get it. Now, New York City saw greater immigration in the 1840s than it ever had before. So 92,000 immigrants made New York home between 1820 and 1830, but 1.1 million immigrants arrived between 1840 and 1850, and then 1.2 million immigrants arrived between 1850 and 1860. And this is, of course, before the very largest waves of immigration that brought many millions of people to New York City between 1880 and 1920. So those numbers are even before those waves of immigration. Now, the majority of these early immigrants were Irish people fleeing the famine. And as I said, it was they who built the aqueduct. But the new immigrants crowded together um, in places like the Five Points that you see here. This is Mulberry Bend. And in 1849, in the Five Points, there were 800 people living on 2 lots. Now, remember that the Commissioner's Grid of 1811 that I showed you regularized those lots, which means that those were 25-foot lots. So in 50 feet, you had in 1849 800 people. I mean, it was just like I mean, it's not something that we can kind of imagine today. Um, so the crowding helped disease spread such that in 1849, during that cholera epidemic, 40% of the 5,000 people who died were born in Ireland. Infant mortality was so high in New York City that in 1850, the average lifespan in this city was 20 years and 8 months. In fact, at that time, more people were dying in New York City than were being born. It was it was a difficult city to live in. And in 1863, the Board of Health reported that mortality rates in the city's tenement districts were triple those of the city overall. Given that many wealthy people rather, left the city during outbreaks of disease, um, and that those same people, often the wealthy Protestant classes, saw disease as part of a moral failure on the part of the Catholic Irish, the Croton Water Board was actually hesitant to use Croton water to clean the Five Points even during this cholera epidemic. So there was this idea of, okay, immigrant laborers can build the Croton Aqueduct, but they can't have the water. It was um, it was a painful tension. And so this brought to the fore physician reformers such as Elijah Harris, who was the first secretary of the American Public Health Association, who helped found the Association for Improving the Conditions of the Poor. And Elijah Harris undertook a tenement house survey as early as 1865. So, interestingly, even though the Commissioner's Grid of 1811 meant to promote health in New York City, it actually helped lead to the proliferation of tenements because it created a standard 25-foot lot that I mentioned just a moment ago, and those 25-foot lots were designed, quote, for straight-sided and right-angled houses, which are the most cheap to build and the most convenient to live in. So when you have this proliferation of tenement houses before any kind of tenement reform acts, we will get a number of tenement reform acts. There will be 3. There will be one in 1867, one in 1879, and one in 1901. But before any laws, you have what were known as pre-law tenements, in which it was clear people were overcrowded and living in a way that was not conducive to their own health or to the health of the city. So that was a really specific problem that was facing the city of New York. And then several things happened in the 1860s and 1870s. And one, which was totally transformative to the city of New York, is what you see here, which is the first elevated train line. This is the 9th Avenue L, which opened in 1869. Today, we don't think about the elevated trains or even the subways as being public health initiatives, but actually they were. It was the idea that you could get on these trains and be taken out of the densest parts of the city, which were at that time the Lower East Side, and literally move it on up, right, out to what was then totally undeveloped land in Yorkville, in the Bronx, in the outer boroughs, in Brooklyn, and so you had this idea that you could come out of the city into what were basically like sylvan pastures, and then you could take those same elevated trains or subways back into the city to work. So, which is why the subways and the elevated trains were built the way that they were, and why it's so difficult to get like between neighborhoods in Brooklyn today. If anybody lives in Brooklyn or in Queens, you will know that it is essentially very, very difficult to get from one part of Brooklyn to the other, but very easy to get from Brooklyn to Manhattan, right? And that was the point, that you could go from the densest parts of the city to less dense parts of the city via public transit, and therefore you would have more advantageous public health outcomes. So today we don't think of the subway or the elevated trains as public health initiatives, but they absolutely were. So at the same time as you are having the growth of the elevated trains and these initial tenement reform acts, you are also getting another very large wave of immigration, and that is German immigration to New York City. So in 1860, there were about 200,000 Germans living in New York City. And by 1880, that number had doubled to 400,000, or about a third of the city's population. So in 1880, I'll say that again, almost 1 in 3 New Yorkers were either German or of German heritage. So those same years, 1878 to 1880, as the German population is exploding and of course will be transformative for what Yorkville becomes, those years, 1878 to 1880, are really, really big in Yorkville for a couple of reasons. So remember the Rhinelanders, where we started? So William Rhinelander had bought 48 acres of land in Yorkville in 1797 and had stipulated in his will that the land could not be developed until the death of the last of his 7 children, which occurred in 1878. So that last child was William C. Rhinelander, who dies in 1878. And his estate, at that point, the Rhinelander estate, all of their holdings, because they owned not only in Yorkville, but they also owned in Greenwich Village, they owned throughout the city. And again, they had made already so much money in shipbuilding and in sugar. So then the real estate was almost the cherry on top. But that Rhinelander estate was estimated in 1878 at $50 million. Okay. And upon the death of this last child, that estate could finally be distributed among the heirs of the family and also sold off. And the real estate record and guide at that time predicted that the Rhinelanders would probably set an example by aggressive construction of, quote, good plain dwelling property. But what good is good plain dwelling property if you can't get there? Thankfully, the exact same year, so the very same year that William C. Rhinelander dies in 1878, the 3rd Avenue Elevated opens in Yorkville. So these are big years. So you have the opening of the 3rd Avenue L. So finally, right, this surge of people who have immigrated to the city of New York don't have to remain in the densest districts. They don't have to remain in what was at that time considered the Lower East Side and is now considered the East Village, which was called Kleine Deutschland, right? They didn't have to remain on 2nd Avenue south of 14th Street. They could move up to 2nd Avenue north of 72nd Street, right? There was a way to move out of something that was really difficult and into something that was better. And why was it better? Well, in 1879, so the next year, you had a second tenement law act. And then in 1880, the 2nd Avenue L opened. So you have the 3rd Avenue L in 1878. You have the Tenement Law Act of 1879, and then you have the 2nd Avenue L in 1880. So you have so much infrastructure and civic reform going on that it's really a moment that opens Yorkville to development in a way that it had never been opened before. So the L brings this building boom. And because of it, you have now in Yorkville the growth of this polyglot, multi-ethnic melting pot, and also a sense of achievement, right? That Yorkville's tenements are going to be a cut above the ones that the immigrant workers left down on the Lower East Side, because the 1879 Tenement Law Act meant that the new tenements would feature exterior windows in every room. And so there were very high hopes for the 1879 Tenement Law Act, but they really did not pan out as a revolution in public health, because this is what you got. You got dumbbell tenements, so-called dumbbell because they look like lifting weights, right? They look like dumbbells. And what that meant was that in order to create those windows in every room, those exterior windows, what developers did was they created what you see here, which are these air shafts between buildings. That were in fact filled usually with garbage, and public health outcomes were not so much improved. So there was really a lot of high hopes about what this would do, and in fact did not actually do. So the Rhinelanders believed that they could do better. And their first development on their own land in this neighborhood was the Manhattan, which still stands at 86th Street and 2nd Avenue. This was purpose built as an alternative to tenements. So what happens is Yorkville really becomes now this laboratory of like, okay, we had the 1867 Tenement House Act, we had the 1879 Tenement House Act, and it's not cutting it. We're not getting what we need. We need better housing for the working classes. We need more dignified workers' housing in the city of New York. Why isn't it coming about? And families like the Rhinelanders understood that it was their, as people who had amassed enormous wealth, it was their duty to create dignified housing for the poor, which is what they tried to do. And so this building, built in the Queen Anne style, cut a very, very imposing figure when it was completed in 1880. It was the largest building in Yorkville at the time that it was built. And according to the New York Times, it is actually the oldest surviving large apartment house in the city of New York. And by large, I mean that it was 100 by 100 feet. So it was 4 times as large as a standard tenement, right? We already talked about the commissioner's grid, right? Those 25-foot lots. So this is 100 by 100. Now, to design it, the Rhinelanders engaged Charles W. Clinton, who had also designed the Park Avenue Armory, right? And you can see, if you look at the cornice of this building and you look at the strong 3-bay facade, you can really see that there is a relationship between this building and the Park Avenue Armory. The Manhattan offered more light and air than one would find in a standard tenement. It boasted fewer tenants and larger apartments. There were luxuries like private hallways, fully equipped kitchens, and even dumbwaiters. So this set a new standard in the sense that this was not built as a tenement. This was not actually even built as workers' housing. You might call this middle income housing when it was built. The idea was that there had to be, in a sense, a middle ground, which there was not at that time in New York City. This was very unusual for its time. Until the end of the 19th century, multiple family dwellings were considered exclusive to the poor. And anybody with means would own or rent a private house, and co-ops did not exist in New York City. I know they are now ubiquitous in New York City, but co-ops did not exist in the city of New York at all until 1881. So this building predates even cooperative apartment houses. And what it did was it created a middle ground. So here was a multiple dwelling. It was not a private home, it was a multiple dwelling, but it had enough concessions for light, air, and ease that it was acceptable to a middle class. So you had skilled workers. There were in Yorkville at that time a number of German cabinet makers, German instrument makers, people who practice skilled trades, who moved into the Manhattan. And how would you describe it? Well, the Rhinelanders called it a French flat to give it the cachet of a glamorous apartment in Paris, where this idea of multiple dwelling for the middle class was already something that was happening. Now, very famously, speaking of New York City history, the mayor Robert Wagner grew up in the Manhattan. Now, the success of the Manhattan inspired the Rhinelanders to continue to build European inspired alternatives to tenement housing here in Yorkville. So, oh, I'm sorry, this is a floor plan for the Manhattan. So this actually shows you these are 6 different apartment styles on one floor of this building. And what's interesting about that, that was a way that architects and developers were able to kind of sell, so to speak, the idea of multiple dwelling to the middle classes, which was to say that they would assure people that each apartment was different, that you were living in a different apartment than your neighbor, even though you were in the same building, that it would not that you would have something that was special that was your own. So this again is the idea of middle income housing, but in a circumstance where you're talking about multiple dwelling for the wealthy, like the Dakota. That was a circumstance where Henry Hardenberg created different floor plans for every single apartment in the building. This was a case where there were 6 different kinds per floor. And so it was this idea of differentiation. Even if you didn't have your own, like, specific to you floor plan, you had enough differentiation that it seemed like meaningfully private, even though it was in a multiple dwelling. So the next experiment that the Rhinelanders do is the Kaiser and the Rhine. Oh, I'm sorry, that says he Kaiser and the Rhine. It should say the Kaiser and the Rhine. Um, this was a pair of buildings constructed between 1886 and 1887 at 1716 to 1720 2nd Avenue. This stands at 2nd Avenue and 89th Street. What's interesting about this is what we don't see today, which is the 2nd Avenue elevated. But when this was built, the 2nd Avenue L passed right in front of these windows. So it was a different experience. And I think in a way it's really moving. If we look at this beautiful Romanesque Revival architecture, this was designed by the firm of Lamb and Rich, who also designed Teddy Roosevelt's house at Sagamore Hill. And who also designed the buildings in the Upper East Side Henderson Place Historic District. Now, the reason that the Rhinelanders chose the Romanesque Revival style was that they would evoke, or that style would evoke German nobility and appeal to Yorkville's middle-class German residents. But the reason that I think that this is actually really moving to think about is that look at the care and attention to architectural detail that is being used here, even though the 2nd Avenue elevated train would go like completely across those windows. And so in a lot of ways, you wouldn't be able to notice. So it's this idea that even though like a passerby might not have the experience of this architectural detail and this beauty, it was there, that the building deserved the beauty and the residents deserved the beauty and the city itself deserved the beauty, even though there was also this utilitarian piece of public infrastructure that obscured that beauty. So it's beauty for its own sake, that the city deserves detail and beauty, like, sort of regardless, which I think is a really lovely reminder of what is possible. And the reason I think you see that kind of really exceptional detail in buildings like this, both on the inside and the outside. So on the inside, these buildings had private bathrooms and hallways, which again was really meaningful as an experiment in housing at that time. But also, these buildings are highly decorative because they were built during what was called the City Beautiful era in New York City. And the City Beautiful movement was based on the notion that beautiful architecture and civic grandeur and public grandeur could uplift the populace. And so it's these little details, these little things, um, that were a way of bringing that grandeur even to Second Avenue that was, shadowed by the elevated train. So it didn't just have to be a civic temple like the Metropolitan Museum of Art or a civic temple like the New York Public Library that were built, in these very conspicuous city beautiful styles. It could also be housing, and it could be about these small details that made living in New York City a process of pride and comfort. Um, Now, speaking of exceptional beauty, these are the Cherokee Apartments at 517 East 77th Street. They are a complex of four connected buildings between 77th and 78th Street, between York Avenue and what is now Cherokee Place. The Cherokee Apartments were model tenements conceived by Henry Shirley, head of the tuberculosis clinic. At Presbyterian Hospital, and they were financed by Mrs. Anne Harriman Vanderbilt and designed by Henry Attenbury Smith. They were created to be the ideal curative environment for low-income tuberculosis patients and their families, which is why you can see the triple hung windows for light and air and the balconies off every room. It was the idea that that fresh air would help cure tuberculosis, and that sick patients could sleep out on those balconies. Um, these apartments were filled with light and air. Again, the triple hung windows, the balconies for sleeping, the open stairwells were all built to mitigate disease. There were courtyards, like you see here. There was rooftop space for even more opportunities to catch a breeze. And the goal of the Cherokee Apartments was to prove that accommodations may be constructed which managed to save human lives. Now, the Cherokee would really prove that public health could be built directly into the urban environment. And when this complex opened in 1912, it was praised as the most comfortable, sanitary, and beautiful tenement in the world. It was lauded and awarded by the American Institute of Architects, but despite all these accolades, Henry Attenbury Smith considered the Cherokee a failure because the complex was prohibitively expensive for working class people, the very people that the complex aimed to help. Attenbury Smith told the New York Times in 1912 that while the Cherokee Apartments were, quote, healthful and hopeful things to look upon, they hadn't reached their goal because, he said, beautiful apartments at more than $12 a month mean nothing to the family that can only afford to pay 10. Now, interestingly, the charitable trust that owned the Cherokee Apartments sold them to the City and Suburban Homes Company in 1924, which brings us to our last experiment in housing. Just a block away from the Cherokee, at 79th Street and York Avenue, you will find City and Suburban's York Avenue estate, a block of model tenements completed in 1913. The company also created the First Avenue estate, a multi-building complex between First and York Avenues that is situated between 64th and 65th Streets and built between 1898 and 1915. Now, with a stunning 1,300 units, the York Avenue estate was the largest low-income housing development in the world when it was built, and the New York Times has called it one of the most ambitious attempts in the history of New York to create viable housing for the poor. Its sister complex, the First Avenue estate, is the oldest surviving example of New York's privately financed limited dividend model tenements. So what does that mean? What is a privately financed limited dividend model tenement? Well, the First and York Avenue estates were experimental light court tenements, meaning that they had those courtyards like we saw in the Cherokee. They are six-story walk-up buildings built around a series of private courtyards, which feature amenities that were inspired by the health and housing reform that we've talked about. So there were wide stairwells and large windows, there were public bathrooms, there was an abundance of light and cross breezes. But unlike the Cherokee, these were truly affordable in a way that the Cherokee was not. And so they became a haven for a very diverse immigrant population seeking an alternative to traditional tenements. So residents hailed from all over the world. For example, according to the 1930 census, residents had immigrated from Serbia and Switzerland, from Czechoslovakia and Ireland, from Finland and Italy, from Austria and Yugoslavia. The complex helped make Yorkville a melting pot and allowed people from all over the world to live with dignity and to create safe, comfortable, healthy new lives in America. The estates benefited a low income immigrant population, but they were not charitable institutions. Instead, they were financed by some of New York's most illustrious families, including the Vanderbilts, the Stokes, and the Goulds. These families limited their profits from these complexes to 5%. And so, in so doing, they sought to find what they called, quote, a middle ground between pure philanthropy and pure business, keeping the homes within the reach of working New Yorkers while proving that constructing low income housing could turn a profit. And they hoped that such proof would convince other private developers to raise the standard of their own low income housing so that dark, cramped tenements would be a thing of the past. These buildings were supposed to stand out in the streetscape and say it is possible. It is possible to create dignified, affordable housing in New York City. Now, the former architectural critic of the New York Times, Paul Goldberger, wrote in 1988 that together with its neighboring complex, the Cherokee Apartments, the city and suburban homes stand as perhaps our greatest legacy from a critical moment in both the architectural and social history of the city, a moment when the solution to New York City's housing problems actually seemed possible. Goldberger went on to say, this group of six-story walk-up buildings, erected around a series of private courtyards, was designed to assure every family light, air, privacy, and a sense of space. To an urban environment that had symbolized only harshness to many people, this complex brought dignity and joy. Goldberger went on to remark that wealthy families who financed these estates, quote, recognized that the free market acting on its own would do little unless it was pushed. And because they pushed, these apartments are monuments to possibility, to the belief that architecture can make city life decent for working people. But not all wealthy developers thought the same way, and the fight to save these buildings and keep them relatively affordable lasted until 2019. The First Avenue Estates had been landmarked in 1990, but the designation was revoked by the Board of Estimate. Then the complex was redesignated in 2006. The ownership advocated against designation by stripping the buildings of ornamentation, then filing a hardship application with the Landmarks Commission, arguing that these buildings cannot, in fact, turn a profit. The developers claimed that they should be able to tear the buildings down because they were not profitable, when in fact, the developer was actually keeping 110 of the building's 190 units vacant and claiming that even after a $4.5 million renovation, they would not be able to charge rents exceeding $600 a month. Now, that hardship application was denied by the LPC in 2014, and the developer sued in 2016. Friends of the Upper East Side actually filed an amicus curiae brief in that suit, proving that the developer was making an unfounded argument because rents at comparable properties in the neighborhood were significantly higher than $600 a month. And so that suit was unsuccessful. And even though the developer appealed twice, the Supreme Court actually denied their petition for a writ of certiorari, seeking a permission to appeal the case at the nation's highest court in 2019. So these buildings were saved, and I checked just before this lecture, and they're actually at this point charging between $2,900 and $3,000 for a one-bedroom apartment. So they were able to get quite a bit more than $600. But given the price of housing in the city of New York, they do remain relatively affordable because they remain standing. So today in Yorkville, building and saving affordable housing is of paramount importance. The Upper East Side as a whole has lost 14,438 affordable units between 2007 and 2020, but Yorkville's housing history as a housing laboratory and Friends' history of advocacy shows us what is possible. So thank you to Friends and thank you to all of you for being here with me right now. And I will go ahead and stop sharing and we can start asking questions.
Thank you, Lucy, so much for such a informative and engaging presentation on Yorkville's experimental housing. I think it's also absolutely fascinating, sort of the connection between Yorkville's historical housing experiments and the present day, as you mentioned, the affordable housing crisis. I think it was particularly insightful. What we see today is the actually acute loss of affordable housing and destruction of these buildings like Soconi Hall, we just learned, 1221 York Avenue, which is a six-floor building, six-story building, which has an inner courtyard, has these like principles of public health from these times. It was built in 1925. So I was wondering what specific design elements or policy approaches from these historical examples could be adapted, in your opinion, and apply to our current challenges?
I think what the experiments in housing did were consider really what tenants needed. There was a proposal by the mayor about a year ago where he said, oh, if we want to build affordable housing, it should be without any windows in the bedrooms. Of course, that has been illegal since 1869. And 1867 rather, but the reason that I mentioned that is because that's a way of thinking about housing without thinking about the needs of people, right? And what I think these experiments showed was that if we think about what residents needed, okay, we're dealing with particular diseases, including tuberculosis. We're not, thank God, dealing with tuberculosis right now, but in the sense that they were thinking about what they were really dealing with, which was tuberculosis. And so they were thinking, okay, we need balconies, we need triple hung windows, we need to build solutions into the built environment. And I think that's a really meaningful way to think, which is, okay, what do people need now?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that really gives us an opportunity to think of like, what health circumstances, what community circumstances is a particular community facing, and how can its housing relate directly to that?
Thank you. Let me go through the questions. Gabrielle is asking, is there another term for the walk-ups here on the US? Because they're not similar to the tenements on the Lower East Side. So she says, as you mentioned, the Upper East Side ones seem to be more middle class, like the bookkeeper for one of the breweries.
Yeah, so those would have been built as French flats, but do remember that the ones on the Upper East Side were always going to be different than the ones on the Lower East Side because they were built later. So the ones on the Upper East Side were almost always built after the 1879 Tenement House Act. So the ones on the Lower East Side were built even before the 1867 tenement, they would have been even pre-law tenements, right? And so no matter what, on the Upper East Side, you're going to have a different quality of housing only because they were built later. And why were they built later? Because it's not until, the 1880s that you have the transportation even to the Upper East Side. So it's really not possible to get there, right? And so people then as now are not going to be building with the same density as they would be, around a transit stop. In fact, today, um, in the housing reform city of yes, there's something called transit-oriented development, which is the idea of like, okay, when we're thinking about building more densely, let's build more densely around transit stops, which is something that the city has been doing at this point for a century, which is good design and good planning. Because um, when you have transportation, then it makes it possible for people to come and go. So yes, the other term for walk-ups on the Upper East Side, we would call them French flats. And then we don't use the term French flats anymore. We just say apartments, right? And so the word apartment was the word apartment really meant middle-class housing. Like tenement in the 19th century was really used to mean exclusive to the poor. And then when developers wanted to attract middle income tenants, they used the word French flat, and then French flat stopped making sense. And so they started using apartment. So that's what that is.
Pamela is asking what was the rent, if you know, in the Manhattan apartments initially?
Oh, I don't know, but that's such a great question. Although we know the Cherokee, right? The Cherokee in 1912, when it opened, was $12 a month. So, which was too high, which was too high. So, I would assume in 1880, the Manhattan, let's say in 1880, the Manhattan was $10 a month. I don't know for a fact, but that sounds like that could have been true.
Let's see. So does the city of Yes for Housing opportunity build on these housing experiments, or does it encourage their demolition? Asks John.
I think both, right? Which is to say that there are good things about City of Yes. I mentioned the transit-oriented development. There's also there are historic housing typologies that are included, like, for example, apartment hotels, things like hotels for single people, like something like the Barbizon, which was built on 63rd Street in 1927. That's a housing typology that doesn't really exist in the city anymore, but could under City of Yes. And so, historic housing typologies such as that, which are being brought back, I think makes a lot of sense. But then there's also, ways in which the City of Yes prioritizes market rate housing and luxury housing, in ways that can be detrimental. So I think that it's both. I think that, well, here's what I'll say about history, and here's what I'll say also about reform, which is that as historians, and I think also as academics, people really enjoy critical analysis. I know I do. I'm not exempting myself. Critical analysis is really fun because we can look back and we can, see what everybody was doing wrong, and we're so much smarter and blah, blah, blah. And yes, reform can be paternalistic and it can be wrong. But usually when people are advocating for reform, they believe they are doing right. And so often, reform legislation can be flawed, but it is real. So I think the goals of City of Yes are real goals. They are real and admirable goals. And do I think that the way of getting there, which is really like a top-down sort of like trickle-down effect, do I think that that's flawed? Yes, I do. So I think it's both, right? I think that there's no reason to be fully against something and no reason to be fully for it. Like I think we can think in modulated ways about meeting a real goal, which is building affordable housing in New York City.
Linda is asking, was New York's approach to healthy, safe housing different from cities elsewhere in the country or the world? And I think she's also wanting to know the name of the Huguenot gentleman. I think it was John Pintard. Is that
Yes,
right?
John Pintard. Yes. So was it different? Like, what was interesting about New York City is that it was first. So was it different? No, but it was first, and it was also dealing with. So New York City is the largest city in the country, and has been the densest city of the country from that time until this, right? And so when we think about these reforms, the zoning code in 1916, for example, New York City was the first. And so often these reforms, they were not looking to other municipalities in New York City. Really, they were looking abroad, which is why we have the term French flat, right? What was being built in France, even cooperative apartments began in Paris before they got to New York, which is to say that what New York City was, it wasn't really quote unquote different than the rest of the country, which is to say that there was no comparable metropolitan area in the country except maybe Chicago, but at the time that New York was making these reforms, it was leading the pack.
Let's see. Yes, Liz is asking, are the facades of these buildings landmarked? I can answer that. Kaiser and the Rhine, the Manhattan, they're not landmark. Friends of the Upper East Side has applied for a landmark status, I think in the late 90s, and they were rejected, and now we're doing another round, and that's going to happen quite soon, hoping that they will be a landmark. And I think city and suburban is landmark, right, Lucy?
Yes.
And let's see, Margaret, fantastic presentation. Thank you so much for this informative, lovely talk. I live in a tenement that I believe was erected in a group to house workers at the Rupert Brewery. Now I know why every room has a window. Let's see. Okay, do you see anything else if I'm missing, Lucy?
That looks like it to me. I see Kathleen asking about Social Security and an aging population. I wish that I could answer that in a satisfactory way, and I thank you for that question. I can't answer that in a satisfactory way. Like, that's all I can say to you, is that I cannot answer that in a satisfactory way.
Okay, but if you have any questions, we're gonna stop recording soon. And if you have any questions, please email us at info@friends-ues.org. And thank you so much for joining us tonight. And Lucy, thank you so much for this excellent presentation.
It was a pleasure. Thank you all so much.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Bye.